e4, king's pawn opening, opening line. The king's pawn opening move is both popular and logical. It controls the center, opens lines for both the queen and the bishop, and usually leads to an open game in which tactics, rather than slow maneuvering, predominates. e5, king's pawn game, opening line. Black responds symmetrically, making a direct challenge to the central squares. Bishop c4, bishop's opening, opening line. The bishop's opening is an attempt to capitalize on the inherent weakness of f7. But centuries of analysis have shown that this natural move is no stronger when played earlier than later. Knight f6, bishop's opening, Berlin defense, opening line. With the reply to knight f6, white is allowed to retain the slightest of advantages over and above the first move, with an 11% better prospect for white winning as opposed to losing. 3d3, 3 knight c3, and 3 knight f3 all maintain the advantage. 3 f4 is an error, ceding black the better prospects by 17%. d3, bishop's opening, Berlin defense, opening line. c6, bishop's opening, Berlin defense, opening line. Knight f3, bishop's opening, Berlin defense, opening line. d5, bishop's opening, Berlin defense, opening line. Bishop b3, bishop's opening, Berlin defense, opening line. Bishop b4, check, out of opening book. Bishop d6 would have been in the bishop's opening, Berlin defense, book opening. Removes the threat on black's pawn at e5, checks white's king, and clears the way for a kingside castle. c3 removes the threat on white's king and forks black's bishop at b4 and black's pawn at e5. Bishop d6 moves it to safety and protects black's pawn at e5. Bishop g5 pins black's knight at f6. D takes e4, attacks white's knight at f3. D takes e4, protects white's knight at f3. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. h6 attacks white's bishop at g5. Bishop h4 moves it to safety. Queen e7. Knight Bd2 protects white's pawn at e4. Knight Bd7. Bishop g3. Bishop c7. Castle kingside. Knight h5. h3. Knight takes g3, attacks white's rook at f1 and blocks white's pawn at g2. F takes g3, protects white's rook at f1. Knight c5. Bishop takes f7, check, checks black's king, and isolates black's pawn at e5. King takes f7. Knight takes e5, check, checks black's king with a double check and creates a passed pawn on e4. Black wins 2 bishops for a knight and 2 pawns. King g8 moves it out of check and threatens white's knight at e5 with a double attack. Knight g6. moves it to safety, forks black's rook at h8 and black's queen, and blocks black's pawn at g7. Queen g5 moves it to safety and attacks white's knight at g6. Rook f8 check pins black's bishop at c8, protects white's knight at g6 and white's pawn at g3, and checks black's king. King h7 forced, moves it out of check, frees the pin on black's bishop at c8 and forks white's pawn at g3 and white's knight at g6. Knight takes h8. Pins black's bishop at c8. White wins a rook. Bishop g4 skewers white's rook at f8, forks white's rook at f8 and white's queen, and blocks white's pawn at g3. Queen f1 moves it to safety and removes the threat on white's rook at f8. Knight d3 attacks white's pawn at b2. Queen takes d3 protects white's pawn at g3, white's pawn at b2, and white's knight at d2. Rook takes f8 traps white's knight at h8 and attacks white's knight at h8 with two pieces. H takes g4. Queen takes g4. Blocks white's pawn at g3. Knight f3. Queen takes g3. Pins white's knight at f3 with a partial pin, and blocks white's pawn at g2. e5 check. Checks black's king with a discovered check and pushes the passed pawn. King takes h8. Black wins a rook, a knight, and two pawns for a bishop and a knight. Material is even. e6 advances the passed pawn. Bishop b6 check. Checks white's king. King h1 moves it out of check. Queen g4 threatens white's pawn at e6. Queen d6 protects white's pawn at e6 and attacks black's rook. Rook d8 moves it out of harm's way and attacks white's queen. Queen e5 moves it to safety and pins black's pawn at g7. Rook d5 attacks white's queen. Queen b8 check moves it to safety and forks black's king and black's pawn at b7. King h7 moves it out of check and attacks white's pawn at e6. e7 moves it to safety and adds a promote threat at e7. Queen h5 check removes the threat on black's pawn at b7 and checks white's king. Knight h2 puts the knight on the edge of the board. Leads to rook d1 check. Rook takes d1. Queen takes d1 check. Knight f1. Queen takes f1 check. King h2. Bishop g1 check. King h1. Bishop e3 check. King h2. Bishop f4 check. Queen takes f4. Queen takes f4 check. g3. Queen e4. b4. Queen takes e7, a4, queen, e3, king, h3, queen takes c3, b5, c takes b5, a takes b5, which wins a rook, a bishop, and a pawn. for a queen, a rook, a knight, and 3 pawns. Much better is queen h2, leading to queen e8, g4, rook d7, rook e1, rook takes e7, rook takes e7, queen takes e7, queen f4, queen e6, queen f5, check, queen takes f5, g takes f5, bishop c7, king g2, c5, which wins a queen and a rook, for a queen, a rook, and a pawn. This was White's only critical error of the game. Although White was able to recover the lost ground, White still ended up resigning. Rook d1, check, protects Black's pawn at b7 and forks White's king and White's rook. Rook takes d1. Forced, removes the threat on White's king and attacks Black's pawn at b7. Queen takes d1, check, removes the threat on Black's pawn at b7 and checks White's king. Knight f1. Forced, protects White's king and threatens Black's pawn at b7. Queen takes f1, check, protects Black's pawn at b7 and checks White's king. Black wins a rook and a knight for a rook. Black is up a bishop. King h2. Forced, moves it out of check and threatens Black's pawn at b7. Queen g1, check, protects Black's pawn at b7 and checks White's king. White resigns.